Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, Venezuela and the challenges that faces the third parties in the U.S. politics. Our guest, Ajamu Baraka, vice presidential candidate with the Green Party in the 2016 U.S. elections, international human rights activist, and an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome to the program.
My pleasure to be here.
You were coming in recent dates from Venezuela, and I read a Twitter that you wrote on March 18, and you say, "You see how they create a false reality with propaganda. I just returned from Venezuela, where the only suffering that is taking place there is the result of U.S. sanctions and criminal attacks."
Exactly. We had a chance to see firsthand how the U.S. can construct a reality that doesn't exist. We were in Venezuela. We had a chance to see directly the consequence of the cyber attack on the country. And even in the midst of that attack, it was quite apparent there was still...
The energy attack, the electricity.
Against the electrical grid. We saw there was still normal life in that country. But when we looked at how the situation was being covered back in the U.S., it gave the impression of mass chaos, of rebellion from the people. And we're looking around us and we saw the contrast and how dangerous it can be when the U.S. has the ability, using the corporate media, to construct a reality to mobilize the public to support what in essence is criminal intervention. So we saw how dangerous that can be, and we are seeing the consequences of that with the general support, it appears to be, on the part of the U.S. public for the kind of criminal interventions that has been advocated by the Trump administration with the full support of most Democrats.
If you read what you're observing, you can realize that the media is an arm of the government or the interests of the big corporations. And in a way, you're saying that the American public is uninformed or exposed to quote-unquote fake news. Is the American public ignorant because it's comfortable for them to be ignorant, or why they don't want to be informed what the reality is?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I think that the people want to be informed, but the range of information that they are exposed to is quite limited. Now, you know, we thought that the internet and social media would be a source of alternative information, and it is. But using Russiagate, the alliance between the state and the corporate media was solidified, so that basically you have now the private sector, the giant telecom corporations that control Twitter and Facebook and Google. They are now collaborating with the state and centering information that the public can now be exposed to.
If that is the case, is the U.S. a democracy?
When you have limited ability to acquire information and you connect that to the kinds of efforts to undermine democratic participation, when you have the control of money in politics, I think Benjamin Page and Martin Gillens, in their groundbreaking work a few years ago, demonstrated empirically that the U.S. is not a democracy. It is, in fact, an oligarchy.
And your experience now going to the 2016 presidential elections, you were running with Jill Stein together as a formula of the Green Party. What was your experience?
Well, our experience was that there's a hunger for real democracy in the country. There's a desire for real change. It's quite clear, looking at the evidence, that a majority of the people would like to have a broader politics in this country. Over 60% of independents want to see a third party. So we saw the real potential of a breaking open and expanding democracy. But we saw also to the conspiracy of the two parties to limit debate and to limit real participation.
For example, you were not being able to participate in a presidential debate. So the question is, who is first, the chicken or the egg? Because you are not exposed in the mass media, you cannot reach the 15% threshold that they request, that they do it because they control the debate. It's a private company. And because you're not exposed, you don't get the 50%. Because you don't get 50%, you're not exposed. And they are in control, therefore, of the message.
Exactly, exactly. And that is the problem we have. Basically, we had an alternative program that was quite attractive. And in fact, you see that the centerpiece of our platform, the Green New Deal, has now been stolen and championed.
This is your proposal.
Exactly, the Democrat Party. So you see the potential of our platform. But this is what we have. We have a situation of a limited democracy in this country. That's why it's so criminal that the U.S. is involved in attempting to undermine the democratic process in Venezuela, to undermine the Bolivarian revolution. And that's why it was so important for us to go to Venezuela, to see firsthand what was happening in that country, and to bring that information back to the U.S. Because we are involved in a simultaneous movement to build real democracy, both in Venezuela and in this country.
So what is going to be the platforms? What they're going to propose to the American public, each of the candidates in 2020? The Republican candidate, regardless who it is, we believe that is Trump, and regardless who's going to be, ended up being the Democratic candidate, what are going to be the proposals? What are they going to propose to the U.S. public for the next term?
Well, that remains to be seen, but it suggests that if the Democrats are successful in blocking the only progressive candidate that they have in their ranks, which is Bernie Sanders, that it would be more of the same. It would be a continual commitment to neoliberal policies that in fact created Donald Trump. So we don't see any real possibilities beyond the two parties going beyond where they are now. The only real possibilities that exist if there's a viable third party with real ideals to address the structural issues in this country.
Do you think this is possible in this coming election?
We know that the Green Party, for example, is going to provide an alternative. Whether or not it gets traction and attention, we'll see. But we have a responsibility as people who are committed to democracy to, in fact, field a candidate that provides people an alternative, a real choice in the so-called democracy here in this country.
2 years with President Trump, and the black community is being the victim of the most hatred attacks of all the other communities. Tell me what happened with the black community in the U.S. with Trump at the presidency.
Well, you know, the attacks on the black community, the black working class, and people of color in this country didn't really just start with Trump, of course. The black community and the working class has been under tremendous pressure for the last few decades. The rhetoric, of course, has intensified in terms of the legitimization of white supremacy. But the structural issues that face the working class in this country remain and are intensifying in their negative impact. So we want to make sure that we don't give the impression that there's been a fundamental change with the ascendancy of Donald Trump vis-a-vis the black community. The assaults on black folks by the police continue, and the mass incarceration continues. The structural issues around issues like maternal mortality and infant mortality, they continue and been in place for the last few decades.
And what would you say that is the big challenge in the U.S. society? Inequality?
Continued exploitation and oppression from a system that is not able to address the real objective human rights and human needs of the population.
And in the case of President Trump, there's agreement among experts that he's exacerbating hatred. We're talking about, as you said, white supremacy, but against Islam, against migrants, against left and right. As you mentioned before, that has always been there and now is much more blatant, or is something new?
It's always been there, and one of the issues that ruling elite has with Donald Trump is that he has removed the mask and it revealed the naked power relations that make up the U.S. system. Barack Obama presented the smiling face of imperialism, the smiling face of continued neoliberalism, And the elite prefers that approach as opposed to the blatant, naked, crude politics of a Donald Trump. But underneath all of that is a continuation of objective interests that favor the rich and penalize working class people in this country.
You were mentioning Barack Obama, and you have referred to former President Barack Obama as Uncle Tom President. You have to explain to an audience what is the Uncle Tom, because not necessarily people can understand. And then you say that he's a member of the black petite bourgeoisie. What is the Uncle Tom President? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the Uncle Tom came from a fictional character in U.S. literature, someone who was subservient to power and who sold out the interests of their own community. And that is how many of us see Barack Obama.
There are people that are really, really tough about him, and they say he's an Oreo cookie. He's black by the outside and white by the inside. Was that right?
That is kind of the Uncle Tom concept, that basically Barack Obama represented the continuation of white power. And he was used as an instrument to move the black community and to move the entire society toward the right. Neoliberalism is a rightist ideology and a rightist practice. And Barack Obama was a very effective instrument in helping to solidify and further legitimize neoliberal politics. That's why we say he was Uncle Tom. He's a servant of the ruling class. And that's the difference between him and a Donald Trump.
And would you say that in the U.S. history is going to be the possibility that one day there's going to be a black president who represents the interest and the concerns of the black community, or the black running candidate, like we're talking about Cory Booker? They're really, as you said, they're shades of the Uncle Tom.
I think that if there's going to be a progressive president, it would be as a consequence of a profound change in the entire society and the structure of so-called democracy here in this country. That is going to be almost impossible for anybody with real progressive politics to win the highest office in this country. So a candidate that is committed to the working class, and the black working class in particular, is a possibility, but as part of a radical program leading us toward radical transformation.
But there is a racism issue here too?
Of course. And we know that if you see how the elements of the ruling class reacted to Donald Trump in attempting to undermine his presidency, can we imagine what would happen if there was a real progressive in office? The corporate media and the deep state would do everything in its power to undermine the ability of that person to govern.
On the top of your Twitter page, you said, and I quote, "The Democrats want war with Russia, the Trump administration wants war with China, and the rest of both parties don't care who the U.S. wars are with, as long as both parties are still committed to the pro-imperialistic doctrine of, quote unquote, full spectrum dominance."
Yes, basically there's common interest between all wings of the ruling element. They are united in their understanding or their belief that the only way that now they are going to be able to maintain their hegemony is through the use of force. It was reflected in the national security strategy of Donald Trump that said basically the U.S. is in competition, mortal competition with China and Russia, is reflected in the domestic policies where the police departments have become more aggressive in policing black communities and people of color and the working class. That basically war and militarism is at the center of their strategy for maintaining their dominance.
You were, in 2014, you were visiting the Palestinian territories, and you have said that you are a vehement critic of Israel. What do you think about Netanyahu and his possible re-election coming soon?
It would be another tragedy for the Palestinians and for international peace. That basically the continuation of Israeli colonial practices that has resulted in 6 decades of occupation, the slaughter of people in Gaza as a consequence of the Great Return Home is a travesty of international justice and law. And we're hoping that cooler heads, the more rational elements inside Israel would emerge, and they would begin to shift their policies and their relationships to Palestinians.
What do you think about the criticism that basically the U.S. economy, the backbone is the military industry, and therefore it's needed to create wars in order to feed that corporation's greed?
There's no question that the military-industrial complex is a driving force in the U.S. economy. The military-industrial complex, along with the energy sector and financed by finance capital, these are the great pillars of the U.S. economy.
You are proposing, as you were mentioning, the Green New Deal when you were the vice presidential candidate. And we have seen that there are new pro-business presidents in Latin America. That has been already, for example, in the New York Times, there's an article that say that those interests are really killing Amazon jungle and also human rights of indigenous people there. So how serious is the situation of the climate change?
Climate change is a core problem facing collective humanity on this planet. And what we're seeing in Latin America and really throughout the world, we're seeing that efforts to try to address climate change, to bring about a more rational global approach to climate change, have been undermined by various Western powers, and in particular by the U.S. But climate change now is a global phenomenon. It is an issue of global justice, and it reflects the need for new kinds of governments to be in place that are committed to elevating human needs as opposed to the needs of the private sector. So right now it appears that because of the commitment on the part of international capital to industrial productions, industrial agricultural production that is polluting the planet, that there's a contradiction between all of us and the continuation of the international capitalist order.
What are your plans? Are you planning to run again?
No, I'm committed to building the Black Alliance for Peace, which is a new formation that's attempting to try to help revive and expand the anti-war movement here in this country, and to move that movement from an anti-war movement to, in fact, an anti-imperialist movement.
And in the case of your presidential candidate 2016, we're talking about Dr. Jill Stein, is she going to represent herself as a candidate?
I'm not sure what Dr. Stein intends to do. She's indicated that she was not going to be a candidate in 2020. So we'll see what's going to happen within the context of the Green Party. There are a few people who have presented themselves, and we'll see what happens as a consequence of the nomination process within the party.
Is this very expensive to run for president in the U.S.? It's just for the elites to try?
Well, it's expensive if you run a certain kind of campaign. Of course, the Green Party, we didn't have resources to run with the big dogs, if you will. But when you're building a party from the bottom up, you depend on people power. And so that is the formula for how to advance a progressive agenda. And we believe that that's going to be the formula for 2020 for any alternative party here in this country. What
is the biggest lesson that you have learned running for vice president?
That there is a hunger for real democracy, that the American people are a decent people, that if they were exposed to new information, they will be able to create new possibilities, and that real change is a possibility in this country if we could undermine and break the grip of the corporate media on information and analysis here in this country.
Ajamu Baraka, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure.